Thomas, you've had a briefing with some fairly sobering thoughts behind it.
Yes, indeed. I've got a document here which underpins the government's science, the science behind its strategy, and it really does make some really sobering reading, actually, Colin. This is from the Imperial College COVID-19 response team. They're the ones who've been advising the government on this, as I say, and they say that we are in for the long haul here. They're talking about how they have changed their minds in the last few days based on what is happening in Italy. They also say demand here early in the outbreak is proving to be twice as high on hospitals than they had been anticipating, with a high number of patients being admitted to intensive care and a high proportion of those dying. So they have redone the maths. They are looking again at what is likely to happen here in the UK. And I have to tell you, Colin, that they are talking about, even with the kind of measures that we're hearing about today, that they're predicting that they might reduce the peak critical care demand by 2/3 and half the number of deaths. But even with this optimal mitigation scenario, you're still looking at an 8-fold higher peak demand on critical care beds over and above the available surge capacity in the UK. They're talking that even in the most favourable scenario, there would be in the order of 250,000 deaths in the UK based on that strategy. Now, what they're saying, that the only possible conclusion is that epidemic suppression is the only viable strategy at this time to, in effect, stop the virus circulating. That would have to go on until a vaccine was developed in 12 to 18 months' time, and that the social and economic effects of those measures to achieve that policy goal will be profound. It's hard to underestimate the significance of this document.
The report runs us through a few different ways this could turn out depending on what our responses are. If we don't do anything to control this virus, over 80% of people in the U.S. would be infected over the course of the epidemic, with 2.2 million deaths from COVID-19. That 2.2 million deaths also doesn't account for the potential negative effects of health systems being overwhelmed.
Think of the number, 2.2, potentially 2.2 million people if we did nothing. If we didn't do the distancing, if we didn't do all of the things that we're doing. Now, when you hear those numbers, you start to realize that with the kind of work we went through last week with the $2.2 trillion, it no longer sounds like a lot, right?
Wait, whoa. Oh, sorry. Did we say 2.2 million deaths in the US and 500,000 in the UK? What I actually meant to say was under 20,000. Yes, of course, those numbers have been walked back, but there are any number of explainers out there on the internet that will inform you that no, these numbers haven't been fundamentally changed. It wasn't that the model was completely and utterly off. No, you see, what he was saying, what Neil Ferguson and his comrades there at the Imperial College were saying, is that if no distancing measures, no lockdown took place, then there would be widespread, unbelievable, monumental death, the likes of which we haven't seen in X number of years. But since that took place, that's why it will be under. The problem with that theory is that in the paper itself, they very explicitly and clearly highlight the 2.2 million deaths, the 500,000 deaths figures. But any sort of, well, if we took these measures, it would be under 20,000 is very much, you have to scry the tea leaves to figure it out. But don't worry, Neil Ferguson, of course, knew that weasel was embedded in the report itself, which is why he came out on Twitter to clarify. He said, "I think it would be helpful if I cleared up some confusion that has emerged in recent days. Some have interpreted my evidence to a UK parliamentary committee," where he said deaths could be kept under 20,000 now, from 500,000 a month ago, as indicating we have substantially revised our assessments of the potential mortality impact of COVID-19. This is not the case. Indeed, if anything, our latest estimates suggest that the virus is slightly more transmissible than we previously thought. Our lethality estimates remain unchanged. My evidence to Parliament referred to the deaths we assess might occur in the UK in the presence of the very intensive social distancing and other public health interventions now in place. Without those controls, our assessment remains that the UK would see the scale of deaths reported in in our study, namely up to approximately 500,000. Interpretation, well, we said 500,000 deaths in the UK because there was nothing in place at the time. That was put in place. Now it will be under 20,000. So what exactly are we testing this against? What is the reality against which this is being tested? Which is to say, like all models, none. It is garbage in, garbage out. And because, don't worry, it's actually better than we thought, because our alarmist numbers scared governments into enacting policies that now are exactly what we wanted, and now there will be less deaths. So don't you guys worry too much about it. And I find it particularly instructive. There was an interesting exchange on that Twitter thread underneath Ferguson's comments where Shyam Iyengar writes, "Thanks. The 500K figure had spooked quite a lot, though I do think the paper clearly specified the rationale behind the thinking, lack of controls. Hope we do not reach the 20K figure, though. Prayers and best wishes to all." To which Mike Bennett responds, "We sort of needed spooking," which is a particularly interesting comment in the light of this, because it certainly does raise the possibility. Lead with headline numbers about millions dying on the streets and bodies piling up, and get people's attention in order to get the policies that you want in place, and then later to say, well, you put those policies in place, so it has saved you. The magic of the lockdown has saved you from these bodies piling up. It's almost like that's a strategy that could be employed, i.e. you could release alarming statistics and models in order to scare people. But who is suggesting that that is what's really taking place here?
I'm Bonnie Allen in Regina, and here in Saskatchewan, 3 people have died from the virus so far. And at the moment, fortunately, just 1 person is in intensive care. The province is still calculating what to expect, so for now, all we can go on is an internal report from 2 weeks ago. It predicted a worst-case scenario of hundreds of people in the ICU at one time, and as many as 15,000 people in Saskatchewan dying. But that prediction was made before most restrictions came into effect.
Kelly, what do you think the strategy was behind releasing these projections?
Well, I think there were 2 objectives. I think the first was, frankly, to scare people.
What? Politicians cynically latching on to hyped up scientific models in order to scare the public into accepting things that they otherwise wouldn't? Surely not. Yes, surely so. It does happen, and it's going to continue to happen as long as people continue to fall for the same lies over and over. Don't worry, the magicians at these institutes, these scientists floating on clouds who would never have any sort of political motive for anything, and certainly haven't received $79 million of funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation this year alone, as Imperial College has, would never have any reason for skewing any of their results or making anything seem hyperbolic or alarmist in order to scare people into accepting various policies. No, never. Except for all the times where we have seen that demonstrably happening in the past. And this is not a trivial matter. Of course, we see similar things taking place in the US, where previously we have heard estimates of up to 200,000 Americans dying from people like Anthony Fauci. That's much lower than the 2.2 million that we were being told just a month ago, but it has been revised downwards from 2.2 million to 200,000, 100,000, 81,000. Now, of course, that has been revised downwards again. Now the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington is now estimating a peak of 60,000 deaths by COVID-19 by August of this year. So that continues to get ratcheted downwards, and no doubt once again the politicians will be able to pat themselves on the back to say, see, we saved you. There would have been millions dead. Now there are only tens of thousands, and we did it. So garbage in, garbage out. But once again, please don't take my word on that aspect of these models. Take, Anthony Fauci's.
I'd like to start with the question of these models, which are now getting a lot of pushback in terms of their reliability when the numbers have swung, 33% in just a couple of days. What do you say to Andy McCarthy, who wrote that piece?
Well, I mean, there's a certain validity to it. I have been and still am and will always be somewhat reserved and skeptical about models because models are only as good as the assumptions that you put into the model. And those assumptions that start off when you don't have very much data at all, or the data that you have is uncertain, that you put these assumptions in and you get these wide ranges of calculations of what might happen, 100,000 to 240,000 deaths. But then as you start to accumulate data that's real data, are likely being influenced heavily by the mitigation programs that you put in, the physical separations, that when real data comes in, then data, in my mind, always trumps any model. And you have to modify the model and the assumptions as you get data in. So I have no problem with people who are critical of modeling, because modeling is inherently an imperfect science. So I don't really have any quibbling with that. And you just got to make sure as you collect real data, you rely more on the data than you do on a model.
Yes, the models aren't worth the paper they are not written on, with the data that is not provided to the public about them, something that viewers of the Corbett Report will know all too well in the context of things like the vigorous and very detailed model of the WTC-7 destruction that NIST provided to the public. See, it was just a natural collapse due to fire, and you can see from this computer model. Look at this animation on this screen. Don't worry, there is a model behind it, but we cannot release it to you because it would jeopardize public safety, so you can look at this animation and clearly see that this accurately represents exactly what happened on 9/11/2001.
It's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
And just as in that case, now we have these death estimate models. Millions will die unless you do what we want, and then you do what we want. There, you see, we saved you. We saved you from the millions that were going to die in these models that we now admit are flawed. One understands how that game works, but again, for a slightly more detail on this, and from someone who knows a thing or two what he is talking about, let's go to Del Bigtree's recent conversation with Knut Witkowski, Dr. Knut Witkowski, who has talked at length about these models and the fact that they are indeed garbage in, garbage out, which is to say, worthless.